we've already had one child, so of course anytime the child has a temperature, I immediately thought I'm going to go and get a Calpol. Just as I was going out, because like dads know what to do in these situations, Minna said, don't get the Calpol. So I was like, of course you get the Calpol, the child has a temperature. And she said, no, I read somewhere about if they're under 3 months. So of course I was like, right, we'll wait and see. So lo and behold, she was right, as usual. And we didn't give her the Calpol. And we just took her clothes off and gave her a little bath and tried to cool her down. And a few hours later, she hadn't really settled particularly well. So around 9:30 or 10, we said we'd bring her onto the, we called the on-call doc and said he said to bring her in to have a look. So we brought her in and he said she had got a strep throat. So we came back to the house around 10:30 that night, and we gave her a little antibiotic that the doctor had given us. And didn't think a whole lot more, and she actually drank a bottle then around 11 o'clock, and we thought, that's great, because she must be feeling a bit better. But when we brought her up to bed around midnight, she just wasn't settling, and she was quite a settled child, so it was unusual. It was unusual for her. And I said to Minna, go into the back room and I'll stay with her for a couple of hours, because it could be a long night. I was just thinking, if she's not feeling well, it could be a long night. So Minna went back in, and then Sophia was kind of crying and then not crying, and then I was lying beside her and I noticed her crying was starting to take a particular pattern. And I just started to, it nearly was like on a timing, the crying, and the crying started to get more pitched. It started to, it wasn't like a normal cry, it was like a cry I've never heard before or heard since. And it was 30 seconds of crying, and then she would instantly stop for a minute and a half, and then literally 30 seconds again and cry and stop. And after about 20 minutes or half an hour of it, I just said, this isn't right. So I went into Minna and I said, Minna, I'm going to call the on-call doctor again. And I explained what she was doing, and the doctor said to me, and it wasn't until later that it struck me, the doctor said, okay, do you want to bring her in? And I said, yeah, I'll bring her in. And so I was going to bring her in, and then the on-call doctor said, do you want me to call an ambulance? And I couldn't understand why she'd want me to call an ambulance when I could just bring her in the car. So my neighbours, we brought our 8-year-old, or he was 4 at the time, over to our neighbours, and our neighbours said to us, why don't you bring her up to Temple Street? If there's something wrong, they're pretty good, if there's anything that's up. And we thought, okay, we'll go up to Temple Street. When we got her into the car and we were driving up to Temple Street, we noticed that the opposite of what normally happens, usually when a child is in the car and the car is going, that the child goes to sleep. Both of the children went to sleep if the car was moving. But when we were in the car with her, anytime we hit a bump, she immediately burst out crying. Like any bumps on the road or anything made her really cry. And it was a bit chilling for me, because I knew something wasn't quite right, that it wasn't working out quite as normal. So we got up to Temple Street and we got into the triage, and the nurses saw us pretty quickly and thought nothing too much of it. said we just had to wait and be seen, and then they came back and said, look, we might have to keep you in for a day or two, just assess her. And I was immediately going, this is so inconvenient in my life. This is just... And we didn't think too much more of it then, because we were thinking we're in hospital, we're in Temple Street, if there's anything, it's going to be all right. So the doctors were trying to get a little needle into her vein for fluids or whatever. And they couldn't, and 2 or 3 doctors came and they spent an hour trying to get one, and eventually a doctor from upstairs was called and he got the needle into the vein, and he was smiling, he handed her back to me and I was holding her in my arms, and then literally about 20 seconds later the arm she put the needle into just started to shake like this, and I was looking at the arm going, maybe they're after hitting a nerve here with some, there's something. And I just said to the doctor, is it normal her arm? And then her whole arm was starting to kind of shake, and then I said, is it normal that her arm is going like that? And that's then when all hell broke loose. Then the doctor just whipped her off us straight away, and before we knew anything, we were all brought into the I think it's the recovery room, or I don't know what the name of the room is, but I remember looking at it later going, it's not a great room to be brought into. We were brought in there, and all of a sudden there was doctors and nurses everywhere. There was all around her, nurses were starting to pump all fluids into her. Doctors were coming in asking us the same questions. When did she first have her symptoms? What was happening to her? Where was her pain? Had she any other symptoms? And I was just telling them she had the crying, she had the pain in her head. And I told them that when she was in the bed that night, that I remember the look that she gave me just before I rang the doctor. And it was just after she stopped screaming, and it to this day gives me goosebumps when I think about it. It was just this wide-eyed, wild look in her eyes that said, Daddy, do something. Do something now. And that's when we rang, and I just kept telling the doctors this again and again and again. And they gave her the antibiotic just before. And that was around 5:30, 6:30 in the morning, and then 7 o'clock. I actually thought I was holding it all right together until I started having to ring my family to tell them something was going on. So I wanted to talk to the doctor to find out what I should tell them. So the doctors were telling me, well, we think she might have a bacterial infection in the blood, and I was thinking, okay, infection, give her some drugs, it all should be fine. And it was just after that I was asking for a little bit more, and I said, well, what is it? And the doctor says, we think she might have meningitis. And I didn't know what meningitis was. I only knew it wasn't good. I knew it was not good news. I didn't know what the extent of it was. I'd heard of it, of course. I just knew a 4-week-old baby having it wasn't good news. So she followed that up by saying that we also think she's septicemia. So having to half an hour later utter those words to family was it just caused me to break down completely, because it was just like meningitis, a child 4 weeks old, and their reaction to it. You knew you were in a bad spot. You knew things weren't good. And back in Sophia's bed, it just continued to be like a scene out of ER or one of these programs. It was just doctors and nurses and frantic and rushing around, and then we had to bring her for a scan down to get her head, an ultrasound on her head. And I was like, why are we doing this? And they started to talk about brain damage, and possibility and all this kind of thing, and it was just like your worst nightmare unfolded in front of you. Things settled down a little later in the morning, around 9:30 or 10. She seemed to have stabilised a little bit, and doctor came in, a different doctor, and said, look, we think she might have this, and we're going to try and maybe give her a lumbar puncture to check that it is meningitis, but in the meantime we're pumping her with all the different antibiotics. So we thought, okay, and we took a deep breath and said, we went, and we just said, I think I went with my mum to the cafeteria around 10 or 10:30, and I was saying, look, go back up the road, things are settling down and all that kind of stuff. And must have been 15-20 minutes later we came back and she wasn't there, and we were like, where is she? And we were like, oh, we moved her up to ICU. And when we went up there, she had crashed basically on the way up. So the move from the bottom floor to the 5th floor, whatever floor it was, I think it was the 5th, that was enough movement to make her crash. And she got pretty bad, pretty sick, pretty quick. A couple of hours later, then it was just back into real danger zone territory. She had doctors all around her. Then they put her on they put it so nicely, they says, we're going to put her on a breathing machine to help her breathing, life support machine. Call it what you like. She wasn't breathing by herself anymore. And, I remember just talking to the doctor, and I was trying to man up to the situation, and I was saying to him, Doc, what are we talking here? What are the odds on this thing? Is she in trouble? Is her life in danger here? Is her what are kind of percentages? And he was like, we can't give percentages and we don't know, and she's just very, very ill. And I said, well, is it 50-50? And he just looked at me, and I said, well, is it 60-40? It's worse than 60-40, because he just said nothing. I said, is it 70-30? And then he just said, if there's anything else you need, let me know. And I just was in complete shock, because I intended to go and ask him and come back and comfort Minna and tell her everything was going to be okay. And that's when I realised that everything wasn't going to be okay. And it was a pretty horrific moment to realise it. And the next few hours were just, every minute was like an hour, every hour was like a week. It was, I can still remember the young nurse having the chart, and her chart was literally a couple of meters long. It was just, they had 46 different machines, I remember, because I counted them, and they were all coming in attached to different parts of her body, and they were pumping in all sorts of different things into her, and they I just couldn't believe that it was me, and it was us, it was such a selfish thing.
Show me when I'm colouring.
I'll come down to you in a second. It was such a it was the shock just taking over of that this was happening, and this was happening to us, and it was happening right now. And the next night, that night, it was just, we were becoming one of those families. You colour in that for me. That's a lovely colour. I love it.
It's for someone else.
Okay. And that night, obviously we didn't sleep. Went into the next morning, and it just seemed like the news was getting worse and worse. We had to go for more brain scans because her eye swelled, and the doctors the next morning started talking to us about brain damage, and we obviously overnight we started to learn, find out a bit more about meningitis. One of the few things I did was not go on Google, which I was delighted with because my brother did, and he told me it frightened the life out of him. But I had no idea what it was, and when the doctors were talking about brain damage and talking about all these things, it just, I couldn't comprehend it. So, sorry, this was the Wednesday then. Wednesday that was, because we were in Monday night, Tuesday morning, so Wednesday. It's lovely. It's a beer. And about halfway through the day on Wednesday, the chaplain from the hospital came in and said maybe we should talk to her brother, because her condition had deteriorated some more, and we should chat to her brother about the possibility that she mightn't be able to come home, just to try and prepare him. So that evening we got her Sammy in, and we sat him down, and if I thought things had been tough until that point, trying to have that conversation was just incredible. And it was really that day when I fell apart, and Minna, my wife, her strength took over. She was just, I just couldn't do anymore. I couldn't take anymore. And out of nowhere, this rock colossus of a person just turned up. And just for the next couple of days, just took over. She basically did most of the talking to Sammy about what was happening and what might happen. She talked to the doctors. The next day I couldn't even go into Sophia for many of the hours because all the drugs they were pumping in was making her body all swell. And she just didn't look like our child anymore. She looked like somebody else's, and she just said she was just in sitting beside her bedside, and I couldn't bear to look at her. I just could not bear to look at her. I wanted someone someone to make it stop. Sammy, okay? So the news just didn't get much better, and we'd become one of those families who meningitis had hit and torn our world apart. And we didn't know what to do, and we didn't know where to go, and nobody who we talked to knew anything about it, and they didn't know other than it was really bad news. And then on Thursday, I remember my mum went off, and she got the cloth of Padre Pio, and I remember thinking anything, and she brought it in, and I think it was the Wednesday night, and they say they had to leave it beside her overnight and say certain prayers, and me and Minna said the prayers, and all the news started coming in of all the family and friends who were leaving messages, and messages of some support were coming in from all around the world. And when people say to you, you're in our thoughts and prayers, and you don't think much of it. You got a biscuit, did you? Come up to me. When people say to you about thoughts and prayers, you don't think there's much to it until they're praying for your child, your sick child, and until they're praying, thinking about your sick child, and then it really means something. It really means everything, because we needed it. We really needed it. We needed every bit of it, didn't we? And on the Thursday evening, just when things looked like they weren't going to get any better, Thursday night I think was it, she just started to make a first turn for the good. And it was just a tiny one, but just some of her vitals started to come back. And by Friday, during the night then, the doctors were telling me she had started to stabilise a little bit, hadn't you? And she didn't look any different, it looked all the same. Now, I'm just in the camera, can we kiss? Or go over, no playing now, because I'm just talking, okay? Alright. And on the Friday, we had, on Friday morning, the doctors came and told us she was out of immediate danger for the first time. So her life wasn't in danger. But they said that they'd taken the MRI from her brain from Thursday. And the results were Friday. So all our family were up on Friday. And the doctors, we went to see the doctors around lunchtime on Friday, and all of our family were in a cafe nearby, and the doctors just met us and they just scratched their heads and they just said, careful now, it's okay. Okay, don't put your legs up. Don't put your legs up. Okay, go over tighty if you want. The doctors just said to us, we can't quite understand what's going on. She said, we've taken the scans, all the signs are that in her type of meningitis and how bad she was and how sick she was, she should have really bad brain damage. She is about 90 plus percent, they said, with a couple of nodules of fluid in her brain, which they said, considering how she was incredible. And they said she might in later years have some epilepsy or learning difficulties, or she could turn out fine. And the consultant, who's one of the head doctors in Temple Street and who saw us for the next year when we were in there, just said, you've got a little miracle on your hand. He said, you've got a little miracle. He said, the fact that she survived and the fact that her brain is as good as it is. And he repeated to us months later when we were in. So that Sunday she got out of ICU and in for a week. So she was nearly a week in then, and then she was a week in high dependency. The following week was really difficult as well. That's when we really felt we needed to support, because the family went home, they were there of course, but that's when we felt probably more alone in the following weeks, because we didn't know what to do. We didn't know where to go. We didn't know anybody to ask advice. We knew nobody who'd ever this had happened to before. And we were a month in hospital and we eventually got out, and we were never really out of hospital for another year. Well, when I say we, I mean Minna, because Minna did all the appointments. She was in for appointments for her eyes because meningitis can affect your sight. She was in for her ears because it can affect your hearing. She was in for her brain. She was in for all the different things. So we were in 3 or 4 times a week, every week, for the guts of a year. She joined the Enable Ireland because there was a reasonable chance she might have learning difficulties, which thankfully didn't come to pass. So we had all that to deal with, and we were lost. We didn't know what we were going to do, and then it was a couple of months later and I was back at work, and I just came across I don't know if it was I can't even remember where I saw it. I don't know if it was on Facebook or where it was, but I just remember seeing this thing, Act for Meningitis, and I'd looked up to see was there anything, and I couldn't really find anything, and I had just seen this Act for Meningitis, so I thought to myself, this has been really difficult for Minna, so I need somebody maybe who can help her out, because I was fine. And I remember I rang and I talked to Anne-Marie, and I told Anne-Marie the story that I've just told you, and there was an instant relief, an instant connection to hear somebody on the other line who would, one, listen to you, number two, understood, and number three, who could help. And it was just like this weight off our shoulders, because I went upstairs to Minna. I said, Minna, I think I found someone who can help us out, because we were totally lost. And then we met Siobhan and Dawn and Anne-Marie, and we met all the team over various points. And, you know, the things they did for us was incredible, and we can never repay it, the support they gave. And the support came in so many multi-layered ways. They were on the end of the phone. They were on the end of a text. They would come and meet you. They had support meetings. They arranged for Sophia to go to into play therapy when she was 2. And it was really difficult for us because it was the first time in our life we were accepting charity as such, and you never think you're going to be in that position, but we were so grateful because it didn't feel like charity. It just, in my, what you think charity is, it was just help, it was just friends, it was, you got another one. Good. It was just someone to take us out of the darkness and someone to show us a bit of light. Sophia, just sit down there, come on, sit down there. Either go out over to IT or sit down, okay? Yeah? IT, off you go. And it was just someone to, you know, it was, they not only helped us with with Sophia, they also helped us with ourselves. They helped with Sammy. They got Sammy to play therapy because Sammy had spent a month away from us. We were a month in hospital and we saw him 5 or 6 times. It was incredibly difficult on him. It was only last night. He's 8 years old. He talks to me and he can still remember the colour of our bed in the hospital. He can still remember the fish tank in the front of Temple Street. The details he can remember is incredible, and he, more than anyone, as much as us, probably as anyone, needed the support and the help, and the play therapy that ACT for Meningitis provided for him was incredible, because it was over 8 or 10 weeks, but he began to talk about it. He began to, you know, it wasn't bottled up in him. And for me and Minna, it was the chance to talk to other families. It was the chance to just have somebody who understood and understands what you've been going through. And you know, to this day, 4 years later, over 4 years later, Sophia continues to be a miracle. It continues to be the apple of her eye. It's incredible that her life, she's just a normal 4.5-year-old. She's full of life, full of laughter, full of love, aren't you? Come over to me, Mus. Come here. Come over here. She's bold as brass, aren't you? And she's in creche and she's going to school next year, aren't you? Going to big school. She plays with her brother Sammy all the time, don't you? Mm-hmm. And she's healthy, and we're so grateful. We're so grateful to Siobhan. Siobhan and the team in ACT, they're our heroes. They just have done so much for us, and the things they do and the families they help, the work that they do is unparalleled in our minds. Siobhan is like a force of nature, and the whole team in there are just incredible. And only for them, I don't know where we'd be today. And we just all want to say a big thank you to ACT for Meningitis for all they've done. Say thank you, something.
Thank you.
You're going to say thank you? Yo, no. She's a monkey.